WSBA Morning News with Gary Sutton. It is 8:35 on a Tuesday morning, and it's always great to have this next gentleman on as we continue to take your calls this morning, too, at 1-800-357-0910. He is Senator Pat Toomey, representing the state of Pennsylvania. Good morning, Senator. How are you?
I'm doing well, Gary. How are you?
Well, we're doing well. How can you miss out on a sunshiny day like this and not be doing well?
Exactly.
But good to have you in this morning, and wanted to talk about a couple of things that have really occupied a lot of the news recently, and one of them is abortion. Mm-hmm. We're seeing a head-on collision right now with Roe v. Wade around the country with all the various states, Louisiana being the most recent, really going after the heartbeat bill, and then other ones like Alabama, I think some of the other ones out there, really going into some very serious, different looks at what's going on with life in this country. Your thoughts about all of that?
Well, actually, I think that the various states that are challenging Roe versus Wade, and that's what they're doing, right? By design, they're passing legislation that is more restrictive than the interpretation of Roe versus Wade. And this is the inevitable result of a Supreme Court decision that was invented out of whole cloth. All right? In 1973, 5 justices on the Supreme Court decided that they were simply going to impose their will on the country, that we would no longer be able to have a debate about this issue, that we would no longer be able to resolve it state by state because there are different values in Alabama than there are in Massachusetts, for instance. 5 justices decided no more of people figuring this out through the democratic process. We're simply going to impose an edict, and that's going to be it. Well, presumably they thought that would end the debate. Well, it certainly hasn't ended the debate, and now that decision there's an attempt to challenge that decision. Now, it's not clear that the Supreme Court is going to take it up. They may or they may not. If they do, they may decide that even though this decision was made of whole cloth and invented, there's no right in the Constitution to abortion. That's abundantly obvious. But nevertheless, it's been a precedent for a very long time. They may choose to keep the precedent in place, or they may decide that they're going to overturn the decision, in which case then abortion laws would vary among the 50 states.
You know, I'm just going to say, if they don't take it up with all the various state laws that are coming down right now, does that then leave it to the states to make the decision in the long run? It wouldn't right now because Roe v. Wade is the law of the land. But I'm saying, does that then open the door maybe for some way for the states to kind of be the final word on each?
No, I think the only way the states get to decide this individually is if Roe versus Wade is overturned. And the reason I say that is because in the course of litigation, in the court system, inevitably this gets to a federal court, maybe initially goes to a federal court. That federal district court is bound by the Supreme Court precedent. Even if the judge doesn't agree with the precedent, he's obligated under the rules under which he or she operates, they're obligated to uphold that Supreme Court decision unless and until the Supreme Court decision is overturned, and the only people who can overturn that is the Supreme Court itself.
Right.
So it's, the big question before us is whether or not the Supreme Court will take up one of these cases. If not, then Roe versus Wade will remain de facto the law of the land. And
if they do take up any one of these cases, it becomes maybe a bombshell in the long run, depending on what way they go. You know, I was always interested in the basis, one of the great bases for the decision on Roe v. Wade was the 14th Amendment. And that was where the court held that a fetus was not a person under the 14th Amendment because the amendment itself refers to, quote, all persons born, unquote, and the threshold for legal rights has traditionally been birth. And so that remains the big argument out there today. Is this a life in progress? Is this a potential person? Or they're saying, well, if you narrowly look at it, all persons born, and that's what they base this whole thing on. And boy, you talk about the narrowest shred of evidence. Here it was.
Well, yeah, and tell me which author of that provision had abortion in mind.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
exactly.
This
and what was the intent
with this issue at the time? It was not intended. And as I say, I think it's abundantly obvious that the Constitution is silent on abortion. It does not ban abortion, nor does it permit abortion. It's just silent on it. And under our constitutional system, issues where the Constitution is silent are left to the states. And that's where this should have been resolved all along the way. And some states would have very restrictive policies, and other states would have very liberal policies because it would reflect the values of the people in those states.
You know, one of the answers that I don't hear answered a lot of times, and I'm just going to throw it to you, and it's a tough one, but if Roe v. Wade were ever to be overturned, and you were to say, okay, the law of the land is that you can't really have an abortion, and maybe you say under life of the mother or incest or rape, maybe you add those. How do you enforce that? How in the world would anybody be able to enforce that in the long run?
Well, it's enforceable because the physician carrying out the abortion, if there were a ban, would be presumably subject to significant penalties, maybe even losing his license. So that would be the enforcement mechanism.
It wouldn't be so much after the person who went to get it as it would be after the physician.
No, I've never heard anybody in the pro-life movement suggest that you go after the mother for a lot of reasons. I think that's a bad idea, but the physician that's in the business of aborting babies, that would be the person that would be against which it would be enforced.
This past Friday, the president came out and said he's going to put a 5% tariff on Mexico, would increase it by 5% the first of each month thereafter up to 25% in order to get Mexico to stop being kind of a transit place for a lot of these refugees from Central America coming north and trying to get into our country legally or illegally. We see the tariff situation going on with China right now and basically a trade war there. What's your take on the tariffs, where they've come so far, how effective they've been, and if we would see them much longer going on right now as either a penalty on Mexico or as a way of getting China to kind of come around to free trade?
So I make a distinction between China and the rest of the world.
Okay.
And the reason I do that is because China is, first of all, it's unique as the second biggest economy in the world, growing rapidly. It's the biggest country in the world. It is a rising power attempting to export its influence and, frankly, diminish American influence. And it engages in really objectionable behavior, such as the systematic theft of American intellectual property. So you put all that together, and I think that's a really good argument for confronting China. We can argue about whether the president's tactics have been the best, but I think he's been absolutely right to aggressively confront Chinese misbehavior. So that's category number one.
Got it.
The rest of the world, I think the president's use of tariffs are actually very, very harmful and counterproductive. We have a free trade agreement in effect with Mexico and Canada, and the president just went through great effort and renegotiated it. And I think there are some flaws in the renegotiation, but be that as it may, there's a renegotiation that's pending approval. And then he just unilaterally says, well, as of sometime next week, he's going to impose a new tax on Americans when they consume products that come over from Mexico. So the entire category, all imports from Mexico is what the president has threatened. That's all kinds of fruits and vegetables, car parts, components of machinery that we buy, American companies buy from Mexico and then put into products that they then sell. So this tax it's going to be harmful to the U.S. economy. It's going to raise prices for American consumers. It's going to make American workers and business less competitive compared to other countries that don't have to pay this tax to their governments when they buy Mexican products. So, look, do we have a crisis at the border? Absolutely, we have a crisis at the border, no question about it. It's because of a flawed American policy that allows someone, if they get to this country with a child, then basically that's their ticket into America permanently. This is crazy. And frankly, the Mexicans have stepped up and are more helpful now than they've ever been. I'm not sure. There's probably more that they can be doing, and I would certainly support that. But imposing this tax on American consumers as a way to punish Mexico, who's really not at the heart of this, the fault of this. The heart of the fault is my Democratic colleagues who refuse to pass legislation that would reform our immigration rules that are the invitation for illegal immigration. That's the problem.
Yeah, and I think there's some Republicans out there that have some responsibility to their heads as well in the House and also in the Senate. And I think, one of the things that needs to be done there is we need to get around to it. I think the president is shining the light on it. I'm not in favor of tariffs. I'm not a big tariff guy, but I do think that, keeping the light on this and not letting it go away is really important.
Yeah, I agree.
Senator, always good talking to you. Thank you so much. We're just a little bit over time, but appreciate you taking the time with us today, and we'll talk to you next month.
Thanks for having me, Gary.
Thank you very much. Have a great one. WSBA News Time, 8:44. Your reaction to Senator Toomey's comments next on WSBA.